and function of the clinical psychologist. So the central role of clinicians conducting assessments is to answer specific questions and make clear and reasonable recommendations to help improve functioning. And so psychological assessment really attempts to evaluate an individual in a problem situation so that information derived from the assessment can help solve the problem. And psychological testing evolved from psychometric testing way back in the day. And psychometric testing was a more objective measure of measuring certain characteristics such as intelligence. And it was very successful back in the day because it was really able to reduce bias. Things such as interviewer bias and all those types of things, the biases that we're subject to every single day, being human beings, we all have many types of biases that we are subjected to. So the psychometric testing was able to reduce that bias and provide an objective measure. And so psychometric testing was very successful and was very popular back in the day, but it made people believe that we could use that type of psychometric testing to evaluate like anything. And once they tried to evaluate more complex things such as person's personality, because trait psychology and the understanding of someone's personality was the strength and weaknesses in various traits, that understanding gave way to wanting to measure someone's personality via those traits. And psychometric testing couldn't do that. It was too objective and it didn't have enough to really take into account of the complexity of someone's personality. And so the role of the clinician was to have a strong understanding of the psychological principles and have a strong understanding of the test and the functional measurements of the test, and he would integrate that into the assessment of an individual's personality. Because psychometric testing, its value decreased as he tried to measure these complex structures such as personality. And so that's what the role of the clinician in psychological assessment. And so the goal was to develop a global yet definitive description for the person using purely objective methods. And the concepts of individual difference in trait psychology were sort of behind this goal. But once they realized psychometric testing wasn't going to be as fruitful as it was for the intelligence or mechanical skills, personality psychological assessment and the role of the clinician in the psychological assessment became paramount to understanding personality in future assessments. And so it's imperative that clinicians are knowledgeable about the traditional content areas in psychology and the various contexts of assessment, and then they're able to integrate the test data into a relevant description of the person. And so that's the role of the clinical psychologist in testing. Clinical assessment, the changes and trends in test usage. The changes and trends in test usage of clinical assessment have changed a lot. The primary reason for this change is the expanding role of a psychologist. Back during the 1940s and 50s, psychological testing was frankly the single most important activity of professional psychologists. In the past 50 years, data has shown that the use of testing has decreased tremendously, and in the past 20 years, they theorize that it could decrease even further. And the reason for that is because psychologists today are involved in such a wider range of tasks. Back then, they were just solely a tester, but now they are involved in administration, consultation, organizational development, and many areas of direct treatment. So the expanding job of the psychologist has been the primary reason for why the use of the test has decreased. Psychologists need more time to do their other things, and they can't spend all of their time on testing. And so another reason for the decline was criticisms about the reliability and validity of many of these assessment devices. And so there are many reasons why these tests decreased in usage over time, but surveys, although they've been outdated, have highlighted the 10 most used tests by examinees and testers. And so they said that the Wechsler Intelligence Scales, the Minnesota Multi-Facet Personality Inventory, the Rorschach Test, Bender Visual Motor Gestalt Test, the Thematic Appreciation Test, the Projective Drawings or Human Figure Drawing House Tree Person, the Wechsler Memory Scale, the Beck Depression Inventory, the the Millen Clinical Multi-Axial Inventories and the California Psychological Inventory. These were the 10 most used psychological tests, and actually studies have actually also found that the pattern for usage, although the amount of usage has decreased, these tests have remained relatively stable as the top 10 tests used, even though test usage has decreased over time in the past, over these last decades. And so, well, the biggest reason for this decrease in test usage was the expanding role of the clinical psychologist. Another trend that that contributes to the decrease in the test usage has been the development of neuropsychological assessment. And neuropsychological assessment really focuses on the brain and the structure of the brain and how their functions and interactions really dictate behavior. So that's a focus of the neuropsychological assessment, and that's contributed to the decrease in the use of psychological tests. And they also theorize that the future of psychological assessment will be most influenced by the trends towards computerized assessment. And so these are a few of the changes in the trends of psychological test usage. Consideration for the evaluation of psychological tests. So before using a psychological test, clinicians should investigate and understand the theoretical orientation of the test, practical considerations, the appropriateness of the standardization sample, and the adequacy of its psychometric properties, reliability and validity. And so theoretical orientation is basically referring to that clinicians should research the construct that the test is supposed to measure, and then examine how the test intends to measure this construct. You need to have good theoretical orientation because it's imperative that the clinician understands this test, understands how the test will measure its construct, and because those are important for being able to integrate the test results into results for the examinee. And now practical considerations are just talking about how a test can be too long and it may cause frustration for an examinee, or in practical considerations also consider how the examinee just, in basic terms, must be able to read and understand and comprehend the test. Must be able to read everything the test is telling the examinee, must be able to comprehend every single question and everything. Just must be competent and able to understand the test as given to them. So that's what practical considerations refer to. The standardization sample refers to the similarity between the individual group being measured and the population that the sample was taken from. If a similarity exists between the group or the individual being tested in the standardization sample, and then adequate comparisons can be made. But if there's no similarity between the individual you're studying and the standardization sample, then you can't generalize these results to the individual you're studying because they don't have any similarities, and the results are generalizable to this particular individual. The results from a standardization sample will only be able to be generalized to individuals similar to that standardization sample. And so that's what refers to, that's what clinical psychologists must consider when they're doing this test as well. And the adequacy of the psychometric properties refer to reliability and validity. And reliability is just, will this test produce stable and consistent results? And there are many types of reliability. There's retest reliability that says if someone takes a test now and take a test in the future, will the results be stable? Will it be able to produce stable results? There's an inter-rater reliability. Will two different clinical psychologists that are administering a test to an individual get the same results? And so reliability is very important when creating a test, a psychological assessment, because you can have practical consideration, theoretical orientation, and everything down, but if it's not reliable, then it really decreases the adequacy of the test. But the most important thing that a psychological assessment needs to have, even more so than reliability, is validity. And validity is just, in basic terms, does this test measure what it intends to measure? And that is the biggest thing, the most crucial issue in test construction. Doesn't measure what it intends to measure, because you can have reliability and theoretical orientation and practical considerations and a good standardization sample, but if your test doesn't measure what it intends to measure, you can't generalize or even use the results in any fruitful way. So validity is the psychometric property that is truly the most important issue of constructing a test. And the issues and types of validity in clinical practice. Although a test may have been found to have a high level of validity during its construction, it's not necessarily followed that the test is also valid in a specific situation with a particular kind. So as far as the different types of validity, there are many different types of validity. There's criteria validity. Does this criteria produce the outcome? And validity just extrapolates and just expands onto all parts of the test, but really the basic underlying key with validity is, does this test measure what it intends to measure? And so that's the main role, that's the biggest thing that clinical psychologists must really handle in terms of creating a psychological assessment and making sure that this psychological assessment will produce fruitful results. For a test to be considered useful and efficient, it has to produce these accurate results, and beyond the results that can be obtained with greater ease and less expense, really. And so, understanding, developing, and comparing clinical judgment. Clinical judgment is a special instance of perception in which the clinician attempts to use whatever resources are available to create accurate descriptions of the client. And these sources may include test data, case history, medical records, personal journals, and verbal and non-verbal observations of behavior. And so this is where the role of the clinician and everything we've talked about really comes into play, because the clinician must use observation of this examinee in their verbal and non-verbal observations of behavior, and use this to really create an assessment of the individual, because personality is complex. So many different factors come into play, and so a clinician must observe this individual in a natural setting so they can see one factor, which is their social interactions, and see how these social interactions, interpersonal relationships really affect the entire personality and the traits of the individual. And so clinical judgment and the role of clinical psychologist is really to take all these bits of information that affect a individual's total personality and use their clinical judgment and their understanding of the psychological principles, their understanding of the test constructs, the understanding of how the test intends to measure what it measures, and taking all these different variables and implementing them into a description, a full description of the individual. And so relevant issues and processes involved in clinical judgment include data gathering, data synthesis, the relative accuracy of clinical versus statistical or actuarial descriptions, and judgment in determining what to include in a psychological report. This sequence also parallels the process clinicians go through when assessing a client. And so clinicians must truly take into account, they have multiple jobs. They got to gather data, and they got to analyze this data with the understanding of psychology, understanding of the test itself. And so you got to take all of these things combined together and create an overview and a concise prediction, or a concise outcome based on the measurements in the test. And so clinicians truly are, their clinical judgment is necessary for making accurate judgments. Clinical judgment needs an understanding of all these principles we've talked about, or it won't be accurate, and the test won't be reliable, even though the test, its constructs and what it tends to measure may actually be measured. If the clinical cannot provide accurate clinical judgment, then if the clinical psychologist can't provide accurate clinical judgment, then it won't produce any fruitful results. And so these are the obstacles that a clinical psychologist faces, and there's a special role in assessing people's personality with psychological assessments, because psychological assessments really are trying to assess something extremely complex that has multiple factors that come into play. And so that is the role of the clinical psychologist.